Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig, and we've got Sunny joining us again as well. How are you both doing?
Doing well.
Good.
Good, good. Well, we've got a great topic today. We're going to be talking about groups. Uh, William, you want to start?
Yeah, so this is an issue we came up with because there's a lot of confusion in the objectivist movement about, groups and group affiliation and, how an individual relates to certain groups, especially with the MAGA movement or people siding with Republicans over Democrats or the left. So we want to define and describe groups, and we want to try to clear up some of these confusions. And we also want to address what some objectivists, including Ayn Rand, have said on the subject of particular groups, like especially your relationship to the government, and how individual rights play uh, in the society, and your relationship to social ownership of property. We also want to connect this issue to various political issues of the day. So we might be talking about immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, and border control, and maybe what Harry Binswanger has said on the issue. So you want to take it away, Scott, from there?
Yeah, I mean, for me, someone in the comments on our last episode, made a great point that closed objectivism puts these strong borders around their philosophy, but not their country. And for me, even since we started planning the show, Tara Smith was on with Yaron Brook, and in explaining why she recently talked about how we deal with other people, admits that objectivism has been sporadic on the topic.
There are, it's a relatively, I think, relatively underexplored area within objectivism. I mean, obviously, we talk about the virtue of justice. How do you deal with other people? How do you judge other people? How should you treat other people? We talk about justice. We talk about individual rights. There's been some writing among objectivist scholars about friendship over the years. I've written some on that. Tristan Delege lately is writing on that. There are pockets of, again, I think, Ayn Rand gives a lot of attention to justice in particular and rights. But then beyond that, there are these sporadic engagements, and I just thought it was something that, because it's such a major dimension of all of our lives, how we deal with other people, strangers, family, the regulars in our lives at the office or at school or wherever it might be, that it would be worth looking into a little bit more, some of what should play out egoistically in these relationships.
I mean,
There,
for
so there,
me, it shows that there hasn't been a lot of talk about, not beyond groups, just even dealing with other people, and that's what's led to a lot of issues in objectivism, the schisms, and making everything like this existential threat. And if you look at it a different way, you're immoral, not just wrong. And it's and I mean, I give her credit for at least admitting that it's been kind of looked down upon, because in some ways it's like, oh, you're joining a group, I'm now suspicious of altruism.
well, I think Tara Smith is pointing to something that's fundamental within objectivism, is this lack of focus on interrelationships. So she says, like, how do we deal with other people? So basically, she's saying, how do groups of people relate to one another? And this really begins with a family, right? And Ayn Rand didn't have a family other than her husband. Um, she had relationships, of course, but she didn't have children. And her family was in Russia. So I think she came here and stayed with, some family in Chicago, but then she moved to Hollywood. So she was really isolated from her Russian family and didn't have much of an American family. But she did form this family of philosophy. So people who thought she, and the novels brought people together. So people who liked her novels and her philosophy, she formed these friendships with them. And then she jokingly called them the collective. So she did form this group, this inner circle of friends, but she didn't include much of this in her philosophy. So she didn't have a philosophy of, family relationships or group dynamics. And so you don't see much of that in her writing, but it does come through intuitively when she talks about government and how nations go to war. And she does discuss a little bit of this, but not much. So you kind of have to really look for it in her philosophy.
And Bruce Tuckman, in 1965, he proposed a four-stage model for group dynamics, and that the ideal group decision-making process should occur in four stages: forming, pretending to get on or get along with others; storming, letting down the politeness barrier and trying to get down to issues, even if tempers flare up; norming, getting used to each other and developing trust and productivity; and then performing, working in a group to a common goal on a highly efficient and cooperative basis. And for me, I mean, I'm in a band, and that really is something that sticks out. It's, we have our kind of interpersonal issues. There are even fights within the band, even some turf battles about what songs are really us or not. But at the end, at some point, you kind of put that aside and you try to make good music. And it's in the end, it's for the performance.
Yeah, I
So
see that your band is a type of a group based on musical interests, and what your band requires. You need a singer, you need a guitarist, a drummer, etc. And there's all kinds of different types of groups based on. So a group, just to set out a definition here, I think a group is a certain number of individuals who come together based on shared interests or common um, values or virtues or whatever that binds you together. And so you can begin with the family, that's blood relations. And then you can move up from there and you have clans, which are a group of families that, have a particular cultural interest and share cultural traditions and values. And then you can go all the way up to a whole nation. Like America has a shared interest in the principles of America that were set out in the Constitution. So if you believe in the Constitution, individual rights and the principles that are laid out in our Constitution, then you're an American citizen. You can become a citizen, petition to become a citizen, and then vote and have a shared interest in what goes on in America. And then you're part of the American group. You're part of a nation. But there's all kinds of other types of groups. And I think, that's just something that we need to recognize. A group needs to integrate with the individuals. So any sort of individualism needs to recognize that there are these groups with shared relationships. And so you need to be able to integrate your own idea of individuality with your group memberships.
absolutely. And one of my criticisms is people not wanting to criticize people like Yaron or ARI because they tie it to objectivism succeeding, rightly or wrongly. And they're like, well, I don't want to say anything that's going to undermine the group. And while on one level, you have to keep your objectivity, there is actually a place for that, about just not trashing the group about every little minuscule thing as some sort of faux integrity. And so I think, ultimately, groups provide community, a sense of, just being able to interact with other people. I think you do have to maintain boundaries through principles, and they can also become pathological when you have to kind of follow the leader, and treating internal criticism as an existential threat, and positions. It's like at one point Jordan Yaron was like, oh, if you think Jordan Peterson is great, never call yourself an objectivist. It's like, what? That's the criteria now. And so that's, we have to, even sometimes it's like, when you leave a group, do they vilify you? And these are all factors that I think they're talked about implicitly in objectivism and on a as they happen, but we see it a lot with the immigration issue and people saying that oh, you're just you're racist if you're not for if you even want border checkpoints.
Well, if you start from particular types of groups, like you mentioned your band, and I mentioned like, a family up to a nation, you can abstract from there and realize that there are different classes of these groups, and one of them is an ideological group. There's also groups based on music, and all sorts of other things, personality. Like some argue that Yaron Brook has a cult over there at his show, and so you have a cult of personality, and that's a group. But I think objectivism is an ideological group. So we're going to come together based on the ideas. We have to decide which ideas are primary. What do you have to believe to be considered an objectivist? Do you have to believe everything Ayn Rand wrote? Or do you have to just believe the core principles that differentiate her philosophy from all the other philosophies? And one of the problems is we disagree on these criteria. And if you're an idealistic objectivist who believes that Ayn Rand's system is fully integrated, it's flawless, and if you don't believe everything Ayn Rand wrote, then you're not an objectivist. That's a problem. You're gatekeeping, objectivism and trying to ostracize the people who disagree with you, but agree with the fundamental principles. And then,
I mean, what I have found though is that people who fall into that category, they're hypocritical about it. They also cherry pick what she's said and written to fit what they want to think, that what they want to believe, and sometimes for social reasons themselves. I mean, that is one of my objections with some of the Ayn Rand people, is that they cherry pick, they take an out of context Q&A answer to have their entire immigration opinion, and say that anyone who thinks otherwise is a racist, a tribalist, a collectivist, xenophobic, and not a real objectivist. But at the same time, she made actual statements about being gay, but they won't talk about that. So they want to pick and choose. And I feel like they can pick and choose, but they shouldn't gatekeep then. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's a debate. They're allowed to disagree with her about one thing and agree with her about another, but they won't debate immigration. They just pull that down and go, oh, well, Ayn Rand was for open immigration because of that one 2-sentence quote in that one moment. But things she's actually said and actually written are dismissed, or they edit her works so they're not as offensive to people. It's like, this is not, on the one hand, they're saying, well, we have to keep the philosophy contained, but on the other, they won't actually respect her and what she said enough to say what it is for real, and then debate it, and then actually disagree with it if they want to.
There's also the issue of when a group was started by like this genius or towering person, and then after they're gone, it's like there's a succession crisis for who now becomes the arbiter of what she meant or what part you're going to focus on. And I think that's exactly what happened. And it's
Well, with respect to what's going wrong, like what a lot of objectivists get wrong with respect to how they think of groups. I don't know what you guys have noticed, but I see people basically say there's no such thing as groups, or like kind of almost if you form a group, you are not being an individualist, but they are in a group. They're in so many groups. They're in like if you're a lawyer, you're in the lawyer group. If you're Hispanic, you're Hispanic. I mean, if you're female, you're female. If you're male, like you're in groups, whether you like it or not. And I think when humans come together, it's natural, and I think this is an epistemological issue. It's necessary to generalize and to group things in order to make sense of your world and go about your life without, it's the same thing as like concepts. You need concepts so that you don't have to evaluate everything constantly. And that goes to context because how much you weigh somebody's group membership when you're judging them as an individual in a given context depends on the context. So, like, if you are interviewing somebody for a job, um, you may be judging them under certain group affiliates. Generalize, if you're going through like 1,000 resumes, you have to weed those out. I'm going to take the college bachelor and above group. I'm not going to take the high school graduate group, or whatever it is you're weeding out people's based on legitimate and objective group affiliation. I mean, it's probably a stretch to call that a group, but it is a group, college graduates. And then maybe when they're in front of you, if the job is physical and they're very overweight, you have to say, okay, this is an overweight person. I mean, I guess you're judging them individually, but I'm trying to think of a time when you would actually, like, if you're going to a doctor, you know that 80% of doctors suck, probably, if you've had any exposure to doctors. And so in your mind, you have to hold that. You can't just take what they say and act on it without about it yourself, doing your own research, maybe getting a second opinion, because you know that they're not omniscient, they're not always right, they're very arrogant. A lot of times they will speak with certainty, and you have to be skeptical. You have to always be skeptical if you want to be healthy, if you want to do the right thing for whatever medical issue you're having. So, like, I mean, especially after COVID, like, my opinion of doctors is so low now that as a group, and appropriately so. That doesn't mean that there aren't individual great doctors when I find one, I'm much more likely to just rely on their opinion. And that's how you go about that. Depending on the context, you put so much time into something and judging a person, you don't have to go through an entire CV with a person to sort of make a quick judgment for a quick situation, as you would with one that you have to be more in depth. Maybe I'm using bad examples.
I think you're bringing
like
up
if I cross the street, because somebody looks thuggish and they fall into a certain group that scares me or that has a higher crime rate than other groups, that's perfectly moral to do that. There was recently a clip that came out where the guy was like, it's totally racist if you cross the street to avoid, a potential thug. But that isn't true. I'm not hiring him for a job. I'm just crossing the street. I'm just crossing the person in life. So I don't need to know. I don't need to do a big individual assessment. I can act on my group information and make a decision. And morally, I mean,
if I can step in here real quick, I think you're bringing up the issue of context, and that's an important issue to remember because context is critical. And the way it relates to groups, in our particular case here, is that you have to remember that you are a member of a political group. And there's a context to that. Your individual rights only matter in the context of a political group. There's no use for individual rights on a desert island when you're alone and there's nobody around to enforce your rights. In it's individual rights matter, or it only means something when you're in a society, and in particular, a society that recognizes and protects your individual rights. So we have to remember that. And I was going to say something about the context shifting with the immigration issue, because Harry Binswanger, had a page on immigration, and he used to recognize that we needed border control, or we needed to check people. Because in 2006, he wrote on his immigration page that entry into the US should ultimately be free for any foreigner, with the exception of criminals, would-be terrorists, and those carrying infectious diseases. And, that was the prevailing opinion back then, which recognized you needed some border checks. You needed to be able to check people for these things. You even need to check people on the streets. We have police who patrol the streets for suspicious activity and criminals. If they see something, they can stop you and, question you. But then in 2015, he updated his page, and suddenly he's for absolutely open immigration without border patrols, border police, border checks, or passports. I mean, this is a radical change in his immigration position. And it just so happened to coincide with Donald Trump's first campaign for the presidency. So maybe
The rise
that
of
was
cancel culture.
yeah,
Maybe he evolved. I mean, we all evolve, Maybe he realized that. I think that he's so rationalistic about this issue. He believes that anyone can come here, and as a result, what right do you even have to stop them and ask them a question? I mean, he's now at that point where
but
he's
it's
like stopping them and saying, "Do you have a disease?" is a violation of their rights, because they have a right to do whatever they want. So he's gotten to that point with it. I believe it's just rationalistic kind of spin out, you know?
he kind of dropped. So he began with the idea of there's still this nation we have, and we had to check for certain things at the border. But then so he accepted the group responsibility at the border. So he's like an
Yeah.
American. We have a nation. We're Americans. We got to check for these terrorists. We got to check for infectious diseases. So there's some element of a philosophy of nationhood in his argument there. But then suddenly he just drops that entire context, and now there's no border control. It's just
Well,
come
and
on in.
the idea is too that if you believe in the nation state, citizenship, all of that stuff, and that this group has the right to invite people and not invite people into their nation, you are a collectivist because you're trying to act as a group, right? Like, I mean, this is where they've
They
gone
call
with
us
it.
nationalists, or if we
Well,
don't.
I'm talking about specifically, they believe that it's a violation of individualism because you're acting as a group and you're judging, basically the other group is everybody else, right? And then within that, and anybody outside of the nation is everybody else. And they have to abide by whatever we decide. And that is not taking each individual and giving them their rights. Every earthling has rights, kind of thing.
So I was discussing immigration online, and someone tried saying that Jefferson was basically open immigration, and so I went back and found an old quote of his from Notes on the State of Virginia about reasonable immigration restrictions so the culture isn't overwhelmed. And he says, they will bring with them the principles of government they leave imbibed in their early youth, or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbounded licentiousness, passing as is usual from one extreme to another. It would be a miracle were they to stop precisely at the point of temperate liberty. So is it not safer to wait with patience for the attainment of any degree of population desired or expected? May not our government be more homogeneous, more peaceable, more durable? Suppose 20 million Republican Americans thrown all of a sudden into France. What would be the condition of that kingdom? if it would be more turbulent, less happy, less strong, we may believe that the addition of 500,000 foreigners to our present numbers would produce a similar effect here. And it does. He's saying that, he's talking about group cohesion. And if you just have this unrestricted immigration, it's going to overwhelm the values that make this an attractive place to come in the first place. And it's also worth noting, he was basically talking about other white immigrants, because that's pretty much who was coming at the time. And so it wasn't a racist argument, it wasn't anti-individualism, but it was acknowledging that, with these unregulated hordes, that you can actually lose your cultural identity, that the group can, in this case, America.
Well, this is so basic. I think people had just this basic grasp of group dynamics. You can't flood your group with strangers who have no shared principles or values. There needs to be, a slow assimilation. If you're going to accept strangers who don't share your values or don't even know about your principles and values, they don't even know about philosophy, maybe. And you have to teach them, and you have to put them through school and educate them and train them to be a citizen. That's a tough job. And you can't do that if you just overwhelm your system with foreigners who have no shared values. So he's basically grasping this simple truth, about assimilation. And we've kind of lost that, where Harry's just like, well, let anybody in, millions of foreigners who we don't care, we don't even care. He doesn't even care if they're crossing the border with infectious diseases anymore. There's no border checks in his philosophy. We got to wait for them to come in and spread smallpox, and then, suddenly now we got to deal with it. There's no preemptive measures. So he's, people who are for open borders, especially this radical idea of no checks, no border control, no ICE, they have lost the plot. They have lost the concept of a nation, of protecting your integrity as a nation, what made you a nation. They've just lost that concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just goes to, I think sometimes groups gain power, momentum, I should say, because of sometimes a shared threat. And I think you can see that with even the MAGA movement, or, even progressives would argue that, it's this history of being cultural oppressors that created the need for a left in the first place. But that, we like to, be motivated by love and group together for love and shared values. But one issue of groups is that that threat or that negative thing can help bind people together, sometimes for good, sometimes, you end up seeing outsiders as an enemy.
Well, and there's something too about it's like denying what an individual is, what an individual human being is too, because we are a product of kind of where we grew up. And I think everybody, defines themselves as by their region in the US, or, like I'm a Midwesterner. A lot of my values come from that background. How I'm raising my daughter comes from that background. So even though I'm in California, I'm raising her with Midwestern values, as much as I can. And we come kind of prepackaged. I mean, later in life, like once you're a certain age, you have these group identities inside of you. And unfortunately, identity politics plays those identities off each other in a negative way. There is, it is true that people do get tribal and they do get irrational about their groups and hate outsider groups and things like that, or judge an individual if they have a situation like they're hiring someone for a job, judge that individual irrationally based on group identities. Sometimes not irrationally. Sometimes maybe, yeah, I'm judging him on his group identities, but I'm not going to waste my time. Like 90% of, you know, this kind of person just doesn't fit with 90% of Midwesterners are not going to be aggressive and assertive enough to be stock traders. So I'm just like, if you're from Minnesota, you know, like you could see that. I'm making that up as an absurd example, but
I know
Minnesotans
some
are
Midwesterns.
Minnesotans are passive. And so the majority of them are not going to be personality. They're not going to have the personality to be on the New York Stock Exchange and be in the pit. And, you know, it takes a certain kind of personality for that. So
It's funny. I heard they were very ambitious about doing things like opening daycare centers, very entrepreneurial.
so I think in a way it's a denial of the individual. I understand what like the fear is. The fear is that I believe that it is more civilized to, I think you can be individualistic and also judge people based on groups. I think you can do both. I think it depends on context. And but I think that the truth is we have to acknowledge that group membership does affect people's values, personalities, character, and that is just true. And then on the other hand, people can overcome it, you know? So you have to be open to that. And, you know, like, for example, I'm from Minnesota. I was there when the Somalis came and their enclave and all that stuff. So I'm obviously, you know, I'd like them all to go back. And, but one of my personal heroes is Ayan Hirsi Ali. And she was before the Somalis even got there. Like it was, you know, she, as an individual, she's an amazing woman. In all women, she is in my top like 5 women that I admire of all women around Earth. And she's a Somali. But that doesn't change how I feel about Somalis as a group and what I think happens when you throw 100,000 of them into a city, you know, a Midwestern city. So
The anger is towards the
you can have
politicians for
both.
doing it. To me,
What I'm saying is, though, you can have both. You can say, it's not okay to put 100,000 Somalis into a high trust Scandinavian city. That's not going to go well. That is going to be a recipe for disaster because of the nature of the groups. And both groups, actually.
To some degree, it's happening in Scandinavia too.
But do you hear what I'm saying? Like, it's okay to judge groups. It's okay to say, no, we're not going to do that. Based on group characteristics, that is a disaster. That's going to lead to a disaster
But
for everybody.
Per Jefferson, it's like you don't want 100,000 of any outside group coming in all at the same time. Maybe, you know, Somalis.
Well, it depends. Are you a billion people? I mean, if you're a billion people, so what? But
the problem here is assimilation and a lack of selectivity.
But assimilation to what? To the group, right?
Assimilation to American values,
to
American
that
principles.
group.
And so when you're dealing with a group, you also have to remember that a group is made up of individuals. And here in America, we believe in individual rights. And so to some extent, you can't, unless you're at war with this nation, you can't just like brush off everybody. You have to treat if they apply to be a citizen or a resident, we have a process to vet them. And we need to be more ideologically based when it comes to vetting people. And this is a problem with other objectivists is they don't believe in ideological vetting. So, I mean, they'll let in anybody. They don't want any screening. At least Harry Binswanger doesn't want any screening. So maybe screening to be a citizen, but he doesn't want screening to be a resident or just to come into America. But I believe in, if they want to visit Disneyland, that's one thing. But if you want to stay here and become a resident, that's a whole nother matter, because then you're going to affect our culture and even get into politics a little bit, maybe. So,
I don't even blame the Somalis per se. Some politicians decided we're going to take, Minneapolis, and there's like a community in Maine, and we're just going to have all the Somalis go there. And that was a decision to, just alter the balance. I mean, even if they had like spread them out a little bit among communities across the country, but it's now just, I mean, now you're seeing Somali politicians in those places as a result.
And you're seeing similar things in Texas with Muslims, where they're creating enclaves, and this is all over the news right now, where they are implementing Sharia law and they're threatening businesses not to violate Sharia law, and like it's a disaster. It's a disaster for individual rights of American citizens. And now, like in Minnesota, my God, I mean, look what's happening there. You have a situation where Minnesotans, American citizens, have to just put up with being stolen from constantly. And their politicians are part of it now because voting blocks work, the Somali voting block is their constituency. And so they're not going to do anything about it. I think you're right, William, that if we just have a rational immigration policy but it's, obviously we have a right to have a policy, but our policy should be very much what's best for us in terms of, okay, you have to prove that you can support yourself, that you're not going to be a burden. Maybe you have someone here sponsoring you. I mean, this is the way it used to be. You have someone here sponsoring you. You prove that, it doesn't necessarily matter like where you're from, but can you check all these boxes? But then I do think we have a right to keep out certain ideologies like communists, which we do, by the way. That's one of the things you check when you are coming in. You assert that you're not a communist. And when Mamdani got elected as mayor of New York, people were saying, oh, he lied on his immigration, his naturalization, because he said, of course, I'm not a communist, but he was a member of the the DSA and all that stuff. So they were saying that as a way to strip him of citizenship because he lied and said he was not ideologically a communist. So that exists. That's part of our policy already, but we used to enforce that people couldn't come here and be dependents. And part of the problem with all the third world immigration is that they come here and they go immediately on all the welfare. And so they really are looting the citizenry of America.
Yeah, I want to switch gears to one of Rand's quotes about man's rights. She says, man's rights can only be violated by the use of physical force. It is only by means of physical force that one man can deprive another man of his life, or enslave him, or rob him, or prevent him from pursuing his own goals, or compel him to act against his own rational judgment. And while I think that is the major way, I think regarding groups, it can also be, pressure to conform, guilt, threatened excommunication and alienation if you don't go along, and those affect people. It's part of how groups enforce a degree of compliance, sometimes irrationally.
Well, when you think about before America, you just had a bunch of tribes or tribal nations. These were groups that fought each other, and they would just inflict physical force against one another. And before that, you just had clans or gangs duking it out. It wasn't really until Western civilization and then America where you had this recognition of individual rights. And then the government was instituted to protect individuals from the group. And this was a major separation from the ways societies formed in the past, where it was group affiliation over the individual. So now you had a primacy of the individual in America. And so you have to recognize that there is some delegation of your rights to the government of America to protect your individuality. There's an integration there, a dynamic that is very difficult for a lot of people to grasp because historically it's a new concept. I mean, the founders created this new nation based on a new idea. But Ayn Rand recognized it. And, you quoted her on physical force, but let me quote her on government. She says, in The Nature of Government, quote, "The source of the government's authority is the consent of the governed. This means that the government is not the ruler, but the servant or agent of the citizens. It means that the government as such has no rights except the rights delegated to it by the citizens for a specific purpose." So the important part there is that she recognized you delegate, the citizenry delegates certain rights to the government to protect them. And this is necessary because if you're going to protect individual rights in a whole society, then the government needs to have the ability to do that. And the only way to do that is to grant them this monopoly of force so that they can detain suspicious people, first patrol the streets or the borders looking for suspicious activity, and then detain people, question them, arrest people on the suspicion of crimes, and then, take them to trial and then, penalize them afterward if they're found guilty. So the government needs to do all that. And what I'm saying about group ownership of property is that you not only delegate your self-defense to the government in some aspects, you still have, your castle, defense of your own castle rights. If someone comes onto your private property, you can shoot them. But in some regard, you delegate rights to the government to go through a whole process of trial and that sort of thing. But you also delegate some of your other rights, like trespassing rights, your ownership of your property, your defense of your property. And if you consider the nation as a group, citizens voting for a government to be the managers of the nation, then you're also delegating your right to defend your border, to a border of your property, to the government. And in this case, it's your national borders. So you have to grant the government the right to protect your borders so that they don't allow in suspicious people, who are not going through the ports of entry, not being vetted, sneaking in, digging tunnels under our border, and that sort of thing. So you have to be able to vet people, just total strangers from another nation coming into your country. You have to be able to vet them.
And we've got other groups
doesn't he say that you it's like, I'm trying to understand practically what Harry Binswanger says, that there's no checkpoint. You walk across. If you're a criminal, we find that out once you're in, and then we deal with it at that point. Is that, or if you have a disease, then you deal with it once they're in?
Well, his position now is that the border with Mexico should not be anything different than the border between Connecticut and New York.
Yeah, right.
But
how do you deal with the disease,
so you gotta,
criminal thing that he also?
Well, you would patrol the streets, I guess. The police would still be in existence. So,
but he's against ICE.
No, but he's not against police yet. I mean, that's probably down the road. But police or the state police would patrol, and if they see someone with smallpox roaming the streets, then they'll detain them and quarantine them. But you shouldn't vet them crossing the border, because what right do you have to protect your border from that sort of thing?
But Yaron has said that he's okay with stopping them at the border, but once they make it past, no, then they're just they're basically citizens.
No, they're not.
If we failed to stop them at the border, you mean if they made it past without getting checked, then they're just here.
Right.
They're just here. They're just anyone else, roaming the streets.
just like anyone else, just like any other American. It really bothers me because, um, our country is special and our culture is special and it's totally being destroyed. And in my lifetime, it's being totally eroded by people regarding not regarding other groups as different. That this idea that every individual is the same as any individual American, but groups are made up of individuals and they reflect the character of those individuals. And, I'm even, there are things about American culture that I don't really like, but, it's, I don't know. I don't say, well, no one should judge me based on that because I'm not like that. But I realize that like if you're a foreigner and you are having a short interaction with me in like say I'm in Europe or something or wherever, and you're going to judge me based on my country of origin and that I'm obviously an American and I'm okay. I don't, it doesn't upset me.
Part of the
I,
shock to a lot of people and me after 9/11 was that these terrorists had come in and lived among us for 2 years or so, and it was like, and they still wanted to destroy
yeah.
us. And there are
Yeah. How
people
can
that
you
are
come to
coming
this
in here with bad
wonderful country
intent,
with all this stuff and then still hate us?
and some people still
Yeah.
don't get that.
Well, they're, terrorists or Islamic fundamentalists in particular, they have an ideology that's tribal and religious, and, they want to spread that ideology through violence. So that's something that and even Harry recognized we need to check for that. In 2006, he recognized we needed to check for that at the
Those were the
borders.
days.
Would-be terrorists, he called them. But it's a whole different story now when you want to open border, like absolutely open immigration without border patrols. That's ridiculous. I don't know how else to put it. It's dropping all kinds of contexts. And maybe we need to discuss the philosophy of groups here and how you go from, your right as a family to defend yourself and your property to getting to a nation that has the right to defend itself. Because this is a philosophical evolution that I don't think some objectivists recognize. And I did some writing on this back when Harry was, arguing for open immigration and with no border patrols. And I decided that you need to understand that there's such a thing as group ownership of property. And this is something that Harry Binswanger specifically denies in his essay on his website, which he has since taken down. But I'm sure he still believes it. He doesn't believe that there's such a thing as group ownership of property, and therefore don't have a right to border patrols or border ports of entry or anything.
So,
So
I mean, corporations can't be buying up single family homes.
I guess I don't know, but a corporation is another type of group, and they recognize corporations. So anyway, pretty much begins with any number of people who buy up a parcel of land to create a farm or something. Let's say I use the example of the 10-man group that buys up some property to develop it into a ranch, or a supermarket or whatever. And they invest their labor in it and they own the property and the land. And then they have a share. Each person has a 10% share in that property, in that investment. And then maybe they form a corporation and they have a vote to do, more important actions regarding the property. And then you extend that to a group of people who decide they want to form a town. And then everybody is a citizen of that town and they have their share is in the form of a vote. They vote for the representative or mayor of that town who decides things. And then you can extend it to a state or a nation where everybody in the nation has a share who's a citizen, and they vote for their representatives. And the representatives are considered the managers of that state or nation. And it's just like a manager of a supermarket or something, or a farm. And our representatives who are voted for in elections then they manage the property that's the public property of the government, or whatever they need to manage, like the borders or the streets or the parks, whatever's considered a public land or public entry. Just like a frontier town would patrol the borders to keep out bandits. You got to patrol your borders in America to keep out anyone with diseases or criminal histories or anything like that. So that's kind of in a nutshell, my argument for group ownership of property. There's a lot more to it, but I think that's something that people don't understand, and we need to make a better argument for that.
Well, Rand talked
It is a
about
weird
how
thing that people, they're like, but how is that? They can't reconcile that with individualism. They can't see that. They think that individualism means, that every single encounter is one individual and another individual.
Yeah, well, I have a response to that as well, is that my individuality does not conflict with my group memberships. You have to recognize that as an individual, you can voluntarily join groups, and then in some instances, you have to give up or delegate some of your sovereignty to the group. You have to go along with the group rules. That's part of joining the group or a nation. You're giving up some of your sovereignty.
That's part of being even in a family to some degree. I mean, like any time you interact with other individuals, there's compromise, and like social interactions among humans just require getting along. And sometimes yeah.
Sorry, in the case of America, just to stick to what we were talking about here, which is a nation, of course, and has very complex relationships. One of them is that you give up your right to just go murder someone who raped your wife. If someone rapes your wife, you go to the police, and the police deals with it. If you just go take revenge and murder someone, well, you're a vigilante, you're outside the law, and you're not really recognizing your membership in the group, because the part of the group rules in America is that you don't do that. You let police handle it.
It's almost like what you're saying is, in order to have individualism, which is where justice is blind, we have rules, they apply to everybody, every individual, regardless of group membership, minor group membership within our larger group. You're saying you have to accept groups. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you have to defer to your group in order to have individualism. I mean, I'm not trying to complicate things, but if you just remain in this like rationalistic individual place, then you never get to rule of law. You never get to things like that. That is what has created Western civilization.
Well, at some point you can just give up on the rules. If you think that your government is just so far gone, which seems to be the case with some objectivists now who are anti-ICE. They're just rejecting federal oversight of the borders, and control the borders. So in some sense, they're insurrectionists, or they're at least advocating insurrection, which is a thing. If you want to take over the group and then change the rules, that's what you got to do.
But that's a violent act,
an
and
unadmitted
I think they have.
Group, to me, the fact that their unadmitted group is the Democrats, and they're trying to stay on their good side.
Well, I consider the Democrats an insurrectionist party now. They shouldn't be allowed to even be a party in America.
I agree.
It's that one before,
and that is very tribal of you, William. Apparently,
well, it's based on their rejection of individual rights. They're basically all collectivists. So if you reject the principles that America was founded on, you're an insurrectionist. Why are you even allowed to be a party in America? We wouldn't allow communists. So why do we allow these democratic socialists? They're basically communists.
We have to be careful not to say, hey, anyone that disagrees with us isn't a real American, or we fall into the unhealthy group. But I understand where you're coming from, and
But I think
there,
but that's because what they're saying is not rational. They're not basing it on rational things. You can say, for example, if you believe in God and you think that socialism is right, well, you're not an objectivist. I mean, you can't be because it's a violation of of fundamentals. And if you are fundamentally in opposition of individual rights and rule of law property ownership, if you're against these things, you are against America. You are an anti-American party.
Well, one of the things that sealed it for me was during the Summer of Love riots, and you saw the Democrats kneeling before Black Lives Matter. That was just a symbol of their surrender to socialism. So I considered
Yeah.
that a very important point in history.
Not just
And there may
socialism, but like race-based
yeah.
socialism, like anti-white socialism. That's
yeah, I'm sure
terribly,
there's other.
CRT.
it's unbelievable.
I'm sure there were previous examples that I'm not recalling, but that's the one that really stood out to me. I'm like, these people are kneeling before a completely racist socialist faction. That's the Democratic Party's done. They're over with. They're anti-American.
Yeah.
They're
I think
supposed to
that's
win the
about, I think
midterms.
it, when AOC got elected, that's when I knew that the Democrats were done. I don't know if you remember, but her first day she did a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's hallway. And I realized this whole party is going to lurch to AOC
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
because
Mamdani's the
Social
latest
she's
tyrant.
example.
the one with ideological consistency, you know? And and Rand has always said that, like whoever has the consistency is runs it, right? Um,
Yeah. And the reason
but yeah,
why
and
I
then
side with
sometime
Trump,
shortly after that, the BLM thing happened.
yeah, and the reason why I side with Trump is because he actually stood up to these people. He's the
Yeah.
one who basically pulled us out of this woke nonsense. And he's a kind of a vulgar type of personality, but we kind of need that. Just get back to basic talking, the way we talk to each other in real life, and stop doing all this leftist woke crap. That's not the way people relate with each other.
Yeah.
That was his appeal because like the GOP group leaders found it easier to scold their own base and try to make nice with the other elites of the other party rather than actually advocate for their group. Well, we talked about a lot of really good things today. Any final thoughts from either of you?
I just want to emphasize the importance of the delegating of rights. I think that's the critical thing here. Is that Ayn Rand is famous for saying that public property is a collectivist fiction, and so Harry Benswanger will use that, and others will use that to say there's no such thing as public property, and therefore, if there's no such thing as public property, then what are we doing? Patrolling the borders. We should just let everybody in, and private citizens should invite whoever they want in, and that sort of thing. But Ayn Rand also recognized the delegation of rights and the necessity of having the police and the military and the courts. She wasn't an anarchist. She didn't believe in just complete anarchy and letting people do whatever they want. She believed in government and the purpose for the government to protect our individual rights. And we have to recognize that that involves some delegation of our rights to the group, to our nation, to the representatives in our government. And yes, we have some very bad people in our government. Our government isn't perfect, but I think it's still the best government in the world. And we should try to save it, at least save what's left of the Western civilization within our society. So, and we need to recognize that if we delegate our self-defense to the police and military and that sort of thing. We also delegate our right to patrol our own property, and that involves patrolling the borders of the nation.
I agree with you. And I think that in order to save our country, we actually have to embrace groups because we have to embrace that America has a right to exist and that we're good and that, or that Americans are good, or even just that you are an American and therefore be on that side and try to save the country from people who are trying to turn it. I mean, they really are trying to globalize the world into a one world government. And the only antidote to that is that you recognize yourself as an American and try to stand up for Americans. And I think about that porous border too, and how a whole army could just march right in. And they're talking now about there being 10,000, or I'm sorry, it's 8,000 trained Middle Eastern, like ISIS style people that made it in during that 4 years. I don't know how many are left, but that's the figure I saw. And if you don't, Ayn Rand was not a cultural relativist. She did believe in the American culture, that it existed and that, it was different than other cultures. And so for objectivists today to act like that we're all the same because we're all individuals is just, it is them adopting the progressive mentality toward that.
Great. Well, we're going to leave it open in our comments section. We'll look forward to hearing from you. I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig and Sonny Lohman, and we'll see you next time.